Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are exploring evolutionary psychology, the field that tries to understand how evolution shaped our minds.
And we're going to be diving deep into the book, Introducing Evolutionary Psychology for this one.
Yeah, this book is really cool. It's not a typical textbook. It uses visuals and humor to make complex ideas easy to understand. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand how evolutionary psychology looks at the human mind and how it connects to your everyday life. You might even have some aha moments about your own behavior.
It's fascinating how evolutionary psychology brings together two seemingly distinct fields. Cognitive psychology, which focuses on how our minds work, and evolutionary biology, which studies how life has changed over time.
It's like two pieces of a jigsaw puzzle coming together.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And the book actually uses that analogy. One piece of the puzzle represents the inner workings of our minds. For example, imagine you see someone grabbing an umbrella before leaving the house. Cognitive psychology helps us understand that they did so because they believe it might rain. But then evolutionary biology steps in and asks, well, why do we even have beliefs? Where did those mental processes even come from?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, so to answer that, we need to understand the basics of evolution, things like heredity, mutation, and adaptation, the forces that shaped life as we know it, including our own minds.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one, starting with heredity.
So with heredity, we know that offspring tend to resemble their parents because they inherit their genes. That's why baby elephants look like their parents and not pandas.
Right, makes sense.
But sometimes these genes can change randomly, and that's where mutation comes in.
So it's not just a perfect copy from one generation to the next. There's room for these little unexpected changes.
Yeah. It's like you're copying a recipe, but you accidentally add an extra pinch of spice. Most of the time, these mutations can be harmful, like our elephant panda example. But every once in a while, a mutation can actually be beneficial.
Like if that extra spice makes the dish taste even better.
Precisely. And that's when natural selection comes in.
So those with the tastier mutations are more likely to survive, pass on their genes, and over time, those beneficial traits become more common.
Exactly. That's how we get complex adaptations, like the human eye. Think about it. The eye, with its intricate design and incredible abilities, it all started from a simple, light-sensitive patch of skin in some ancient creature.
That's amazing.
Right, it's mind-blowing. And this complex organ arose from a series of accidental but beneficial changes over millions of years.
So how does this all connect to our minds? Is evolutionary psychology saying that our brains are also a product of this long evolutionary process?
That's the core idea. Evolutionary psychology sees the mind not as a blank slate, but as a collection of specialized modules, each shaped by natural selection to solve specific problems that our ancestors faced. Imagine it like a toolbox filled with tools for survival, each designed for a specific purpose.
So instead of being born with a completely empty mind, we're already equipped with certain predispositions and tendencies that were helpful for survival in the past.
Exactly. And to understand these mental modules, we need to picture the environment where they evolved. The African savanna, hot, flat, covered in grass and trees, home to predators and prey. It's a far cry from the world we live in today, yet our minds still bear the imprint of those ancient challenges.
It's like we're walking around with Stone Age brains in a digital world.
The book uses a great image to illustrate this. It shows a caveman with a computer, trying to figure out how to use it. It highlights how our minds were shaped for a different environment than the one we live in today.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can already see how this might explain some of our seemingly irrational fears and behaviors. Like, I know logically that a spider in my house is unlikely to harm me, but I still get that instinctive jolt of fear.
That's a great example. That reaction might seem irrational in the context of your modern safe environment, but it makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. Our ancestors who were quick to react to potential threats, even if they turned out to be harmless, were more likely to survive and pass on their genes.
So those fast and dirty reactions, as the book calls them, were actually beneficial in the past, even if they sometimes lead to false alarms today.
Precisely. It's like having a smoke detector that's a little too sensitive.
Right.
It might go off occasionally for no reason, but it's better to be overly cautious than to risk your house burning down. In the same way, our brains are wired to err on the side of caution, even if it means sometimes overreacting to harmless stimuli.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like having a glimpse into the inner workings of our minds and seeing those ancient survival mechanisms still at play. But what are some of the other modules that were shaped by the challenges of the savannah?
Well, apart from avoiding predators, Our ancestors also needed to find the right food-form alliances and friendships and navigate complex social situations. You know, each of these challenges favored the development of specific mental modules that helped our ancestors survive and thrive.
So it's not just about staying alive in a physical sense, but also about navigating the social world and finding your place within a group.
Exactly. For our ancestors, belonging to a group was essential for survival. You know, they relied on each other for protection, food sharing, and raising offspring. But group living also presents unique challenges, like the free rider problem.
The free rider problem, what's that?
Well, it's the dilemma of how to make sure that everyone contributes their fair share to the group, you know. After all, some individuals might try to reap the benefits of group life without pulling their weight.
It's like that person in a group project who disappears but still wants credit.
Exactly. So evolutionary psychology suggests that to combat this, a fascinating mechanism called reciprocal altruism might have evolved.
Reciprocal altruism.
Essentially, it's the idea of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Okay, I get it.
Those who cooperated with others, who cooperated back but avoided those who cheated, ended up doing better in the long run. It's like having a mental scorecard for social interactions, favoring those who play fair.
So it's not just about being indiscriminately nice to everyone, but rather about being strategic in who you choose to cooperate with. Those who were good at recognizing and responding to these social cues would have had a survival advantage.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting. The book even uses the analogy of a tit-for-tat tournament, where different strategies for social interaction are pitted against each other. And guess what? The simplest strategy, tit-for-tat, where you cooperate on the first move and then simply copy your opponent's previous move, consistently emerged as one of the most successful approachment.
So even in complex social situations, a simple strategy based on reciprocity can be incredibly effective. That's fascinating. But what about family? How does evolutionary psychology explain our deep-seated drive to protect and care for our children and relatives?
Well, from a purely genetic perspective, it makes sense to invest in those who share our genes. After all, their survival increases the likelihood of passing on those genes to future generations.
Mhm.
So parents often make incredible sacrifices for their children, and this isn't just a human thing. We see similar behaviors across the animal kingdom.
Right, like birds feeding their chicks or lionesses protecting their cubs.
Exactly. But what about situations where the genetic connection isn't as straightforward, like with step-parenting?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, that's where things get a bit more complex, and the book presents a rather stark statistic. Children are 70 times more likely to be killed by a step-parent than a biological parent.
Wow, that's a pretty disturbing statistic.
Yeah, it is. It highlights the potential for conflict when the evolutionary drive to protect one's own genetic offspring might clash with the need to care for stepchildren.
That's a powerful reminder that while these evolutionary drives are powerful, they can also have unintended consequences. But before we delve deeper into that, let's talk about another remarkable human trait: language.
Oh yes, language. One of the most interesting things about language is that it seems to have evolved primarily for social reasons.
Really?
Yeah, for gossip.
I would have thought it was for more, practical things like hunting or sharing important information.
Well, those things too. But think about it. Our ancestors needed to know who to trust, who to avoid, and who was a potential mate. Sharing social information, even if it was just gossip, was crucial for navigating the complex social landscape.
So those water cooler conversations about who's dating whom might actually be fulfilling an ancient evolutionary purpose.
Exactly. According to anthropologist Robin Dunbar, language primarily evolved for exactly that, exchanging social information. It allowed our ancestors to cooperate on hunts, warn each other about dangers, and pass on knowledge to future generations.
That makes sense. It's like having a constant stream of updates about your social network, helping you stay informed and make better decisions. But how did we even develop such a complex system of communication in the first place? It seems like a huge leap from grunts and gestures to full-blown language.
It is a remarkable feat, and it involved significant anatomical changes. For example, the position of the larynx in humans is much lower than in other primates. This allows us to produce a wider range of sounds, but it also comes with a risk choking.
So we traded the ability to breathe easily for the ability to gossip. That's quite a trade-off. But I guess the benefits of language must have outweighed the risks.
Yeah, the benefits were huge. Language allowed for unprecedented levels of cooperation, leading to the development of tools, agriculture, and eventually civilization itself.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from basic survival instincts to the complexities of social life and language. But what about love and relationships? How does evolutionary psychology explain our desires for connection and companionship?
Well, in a world without Tinder or matchmaking apps, our ancestors had to rely on behavioral cues to determine who would make a good mate. And when it came to raising children, qualities like kindness, generosity, and trustworthiness were highly valued.
Those sound like pretty good qualities even today. So are you saying that our ancient ancestors were essentially looking for the same things we are? Someone who's kind, caring, and supportive.
In many ways, yes. Remember, the fundamental challenges of raising offspring haven't changed that much. Our ancestors needed partners who would invest in their children, protect them from harm, and contribute to the family's well-being. These deep-seated desires for love, connection, and family are rooted in our evolutionary past.
It's fascinating to think that our modern-day relationship preferences might be influenced by these ancient evolutionary drives. But before we get too carried away with attributing everything to evolution, the book makes an important distinction. It points out that not every trait we possess is a direct adaptation.
That's right. Alongside adaptations, there are also side effects and byproducts, traits that haven't been directly selected for, but arise as a consequence of other adaptations.
Can you give us an example?
Sure. Think about the white color of our bones. It's not that white bones were specifically advantageous for survival. The whiteness is simply a side effect of their calcium composition. Calcium happens to be white, and it's essential for bone strength.
So it's like a happy accident. The whiteness of bones is a byproduct of a different adaptation, the need for strong bones.
Precisely. And this distinction is important because it reminds us that not everything we observe in nature has a direct adaptive explanation. Sometimes traits arise as unintended consequences of other processes.
The book also uses the example of reading. We don't have a specific reading module in our brains, right?
Correct. Reading is a relatively recent invention in human history. It's not something our ancestors would have needed to survive on the savannah. It's a byproduct of other modules like vision and language, which evolved for different purposes.
So our brains are incredibly adaptable, capable of repurposing existing modules for new skills and challenges. But the book also offers a word of caution, right? It talks about the potential for misinterpreting or misusing evolutionary psychology.
Yes, this is an important point. Understanding our evolved psychology can be incredibly insightful, but it's crucial to avoid falling into the trap of biological determinism.
Meaning we're not simply puppets controlled by our genes. We have free will and the ability to make choices.
Exactly. Evolutionary psychology doesn't offer a moral justification for any particular behavior. It simply provides a framework for understanding the origins of our tendencies, but it doesn't dictate how we should act.
So while acknowledging our evolutionary past is important, we should be cautious about drawing simplistic conclusions or using it to justify harmful actions.
Absolutely. Evolutionary psychology is a powerful tool for understanding human nature, but it's essential to wield it responsibly and with a nuanced perspective.
Well, that was quite a whirlwind tour through the basics of evolutionary psychology. We've covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure you're already starting to see the world through a slightly different lens. But don't worry, we're just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of these mental modules in more detail, looking at how they operate in our everyday lives and how they might explain some of our seemingly irrational behaviors.
And we'll also delve into some of the more complex and controversial aspects of evolutionary psychology, exploring the nuances of these theories and how they can be applied to real-world issues.
So stay tuned for part 2 of our deep dive into evolutionary psychology, where we'll unpack even more fascinating insights from the book, Introducing Evolutionary Psychology. Until then, keep those curious minds engaged. Welcome back to our deep dive into evolutionary psychology. In the last part, we laid the groundwork, exploring the basic principles of evolution and how those forces shaped our minds. Now let's get into some specific mental modules, those fascinating adaptations that helped our ancestors navigate the challenges of the savannah.
Like that fast and dirty predator detection system we talk about.
Yeah.
That's a great example of how our evolved minds can sometimes lead to quirks in our modern lives.
Yeah, like how I still jump at the sight of a garden hose, even though I know it's not a snake. It feels kind of silly, but I guess it makes sense, from an evolutionary perspective.
Exactly. It's a trade-off, right?
Yeah.
Our ancestors who were super cautious, reacting quickly to potential threats, well, they were more likely to survive even if it meant a few false alarms.
Right.
And that same system is still running in our brains today, even though we don't really face lions and tigers on a daily basis.
It's crazy to think that those ancient survival mechanisms are still influencing us. But let's move on to another module. What about food preferences? How did our ancestors figure out what was safe to eat? I mean, they didn't have nutrition labels or supermarkets.
Well, they had to rely on their senses and instincts, and One of the key players here is disgust, that yucky feeling of revulsion we get when we encounter something potentially harmful.
So disgust isn't just about avoiding things that taste bad, but it also protects us from things that might be poisonous or contaminated.
Exactly. Think about the feeling you get when you smell rotten food or see something crawling with bugs. That's disgust hard at work, steering you away from potential harm. Our ancestors, who were more sensitive to those cues, were less likely to get sick, and more likely to survive.
Makes sense. It's like our bodies have this built-in warning system that's been fine-tuned over millions of years of evolution. But disgust isn't just about food, is it? I think I read somewhere that it also has something to do with social judgments and moral decisions.
That's a fascinating area of research. Disgust originally evolved to protect us from physical contamination, but it seems to have expanded its influence to include social and moral transgressions.
Interesting.
Like you might feel disgust when you see someone cheating or lying.
So something that started out as a basic survival mechanism can influence our behavior and even our sense of right and wrong. Wow. But let's go back to social interactions. We talked about the free rider problem and how reciprocal altruism might have evolved to solve it. But is there more to it than just tit for tat?
Oh, definitely. Tit for tat is a great starting point.
Mm.
It was a simple and effective strategy. But social interactions are rarely that straightforward. There are different levels of cooperation, right? From one-time encounters to long-term relationships. And within those relationships, there are different costs and benefits to weigh.
So the idea of reciprocity might be universal, but the way it works can vary a lot depending on the situation.
Exactly. For example, imagine you're playing a game with a friend where you have to decide whether to cooperate or betray them.
Okay.
If it's a one-time game, then tit for tat might be a good bet. But if you're playing multiple rounds, then you need to think about more complex strategies like maybe forgiving a betrayal or two or slowly building trust over time.
It's amazing how much goes into something as simple as cooperation. But let's switch gears to family. We talked about the strong drive to protect our own children and relatives. But what happens when the genetic connection isn't so clear-cut, like in blended families?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting and maybe a little tricky. You see, evolutionary psychology doesn't shy away from those tougher questions about human nature.
Okay.
While that drive to protect our genes is strong, it can create conflict, especially when stepchildren are involved.
Yeah, we touched on that earlier with that statistic about children being more likely to be harmed by a step-parent. It's a tough reality.
It is. But it highlights the power of those evolutionary forces. There are different theories in evolutionary psychology trying to explain this, like the idea of parental investment and how resources might be allocated differently when there are competing interests.
So it's not about saying all step-parents are bad, but rather about understanding the evolutionary pressures that might be at play in those families.
Precisely. Remember, evolutionary psychology is about explaining, not judging.
Yeah.
It helps us understand those underlying mechanisms that shape our behavior.
Right. So we're not saying any behavior is right or wrong, just trying to understand where it comes from. But speaking of complex behaviors, let's talk about language. We said earlier that it evolved for social reasons, especially sharing information and gossip. But how did such a complex system of communication even get started?
It's truly remarkable. And it involves some pretty big changes in our anatomy, like that lowered larynx we talked about earlier, which lets us make a wider range of sounds.
Yeah.
But it also comes with a risk.
Choking. So we risked choking to death just so we could gossip. That's pretty wild. But the benefits must have been huge to outweigh a risk like that.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Language lets us coordinate our actions, share knowledge, tell stories, and build complex societies. It's the foundation of human culture and everything that makes us unique.
It's incredible that something as essential as language might have come from that need to share social information. But we can't forget about another big part of social life, finding a mate. How did our ancestors handle romance without dating apps and all that?
Well, they had to rely on behavior and looks to figure out who'd make a good partner. And those preferences were influenced by the challenges of raising children. In a world without modern medicine or child care, qualities like kindness, generosity, and trustworthiness were super important.
So are you saying all those romantic comedies where the girl falls for the bad boy are totally wrong?
Well, let's just say that from an evolutionary perspective, choosing someone unreliable and impulsive maybe wasn't the best strategy for making sure your kid survived.
Makes sense. But even today, people make what seem like irrational choices in love and relationships.
Of course. Remember, evolutionary psychology doesn't control our every action. It just provides a framework for understanding those underlying drives that might be influencing our behavior.
Right.
We still have free will, And we make choices based on lots of things, like our personal experiences, cultural norms, individual preferences.
So while evolution might give us some insights into why we're drawn to certain people, it doesn't control our every romantic decision. But before we finish up this part, there's one more thing to address. We've talked about adaptations, those traits that evolved because they helped us survive, but not every trait we have is a direct adaptation, right?
That's right. There are also side effects and byproducts, traits that weren't directly selected for, but kind of came along for the ride. Remember the white color of bones? That's a classic byproduct.
Oh, I
The whiteness itself wasn't important for survival, but it's there because strong bones need calcium, and calcium happens to be white.
It's like a bonus feature, white bones as a side effect of strong bones. The book also talks about reading as an example. We don't have a special reading module in our brains.
Exactly. Reading is pretty new in human history. Our ancestors didn't need it to survive on the savannah. It's a byproduct of other modules like vision and language, which evolved for totally different reasons.
So our brains are adaptable, taking existing modules and using them for new skills and challenges. But how do we know which traits are adaptations and which are just byproducts?
That's a key question in evolutionary psychology, and it's not always easy to figure out. Scientists use different methods to try to tease apart these explanations, looking for clues about design features that specifically solve problems related to survival. But it's an ongoing debate, and we still have a lot to learn.
Wow, so evolutionary psychology isn't just about having all the answers. It's a way of asking questions, a new perspective to view human behavior and understand its deeper roots. But are there any downsides to this approach? Can evolutionary psychology be misinterpreted or even misused?
That's a great question, and one we'll definitely explore in the last part of our deep dive. Evolutionary psychology can be really powerful for understanding human nature, but it's important to use it responsibly and to be aware of its limits. We'll look at some of those ethical considerations and potential misunderstandings, so stay tuned.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. I can't wait to hear more. But for now, let's give our listeners a chance to think about everything we've covered. We've learned about how evolution has shaped our fears, our food preferences, our social strategies, even our desires for love and connection. But there's still so much more to discover. In the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore some of the more complex and nuanced aspects of evolutionary psychology. So be sure to join us then. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into evolutionary psychology. We've been exploring the savanna of our minds, discovering how those ancient adaptations still influence us today. But as with any powerful tool, evolutionary psychology needs to be handled with care.
Absolutely. In this last part, let's focus on how we can apply this knowledge responsibly. Evolutionary psychology can offer incredible insights, but it's not about saying, well, this is how it is, so just deal with it.
Right.
It's more about understanding where these tendencies come from so we can make more informed choices about how we live our lives.
So it's about self-awareness, not resignation.
Exactly. For example, understanding our evolved fear of snakes, even harmless ones, could help someone with a phobia to seek therapy and overcome that fear.
That's a good point. It's like we're getting a peek behind the curtain of our minds, helping us understand why we do the things we do. And that understanding can be really empowering.
It can definitely spark some interesting conversations too.
Yeah.
Imagine discussing these ideas from the book with your friends or family. Suddenly, those everyday quirks and annoyances take on a whole new meaning.
Oh, totally. Like if your friend is always late, maybe it's not just them being flaky, but some leftover instinct from avoiding predators hiding in the bushes. Well, maybe not, but you get the idea.
Perhaps. But on a more serious note, understanding the evolutionary roots of something like jealousy might help couples navigate those tricky emotions with more empathy and understanding.
That's a great point. So what does all this mean for us, for the modern day descendants of those savanna-dwelling ancestors?
If you zoom out to the bigger picture, it means we're not just products of our genes or our environment, but a mix of both. We carry that evolutionary history within us, but we also have the power to shape our own futures.
Which brings us to an important question. How do we use this knowledge wisely? I mean, evolutionary psychology can't tell us what's right or wrong, but it can help us understand where our behaviors come from and make better choices.
Exactly. Think of it like having an instruction manual for the human mind. It doesn't tell you what to do with your life, but it does give you some valuable insights into how the system works.
Right, but as we mentioned earlier, there's always a potential for misuse. The book warns about misinterpreting evolutionary psychology to justify harmful ideas like social Darwinism.
Yeah, definitely. Just because a behavior might have been helpful in the past, it doesn't mean it's okay now. We have to remember that evolutionary psychology is about describing things as They are not about saying how they should be.
It's a good reminder that we're not controlled by our genes. We have the ability to reason, to empathize, and to make moral judgments.
And those abilities allow us to go beyond our basic instincts. We can choose to act in ways that benefit not just ourselves, but also our communities and future generations.
So, after taking this deep dive into evolutionary psychology, we've learned that our minds are far from blank slates. They're full of these fascinating specialized modules, each one shaped by natural selection. And while those modules were helpful for our ancestors on the African savanna, they can sometimes lead to quirks and worries in our modern world.
But that's not the whole story. By understanding these evolved tendencies, we can understand ourselves and others better, leading to more informed choices and hopefully more compassion.
It's like we've been given a key to unlock some of the mysteries of the human mind. And with that key comes a responsibility to use this knowledge wisely and ethically.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd like to leave you with a final thought. Now that you've had a glimpse into the world of evolutionary psychology, what patterns or behaviors in your own life start to make more sense through this lens?
That's a great question to think about. Exploring this book with you has definitely given me some aha moments, and it's a journey I recommend to anyone who's curious about the hidden forces that shape how we think, feel, and behave. So until next time, keep those curious minds engaged.